Welcome to our webinar on Palestine's right under international law. Today, we will be discussing a topic of global significance. Given the situation at hand and considering the heinous human rights violation against the Palestinians and the immense suffering and the destruction of the infrastructure and the violence and torture being perpetrated against them, and unlawfully cutting the food, electricity, and water. Given the situation at hand, we would like to discuss this global conflict from a perspective of international law. We will be having a thoughtful discussion today, and we will be discussing different dimensions of international law about the given conflict, such as the right to occupation under international law, human rights, the relevance of international law, accountability, and mobilizing the international community towards ceasefire. Today, we have with us our esteemed guest, Dr. Shahd Hammouri. And Dr. Shahd Hammouri is uh, as a lecturer at University of Kent. Dr. Shahd has also previously taught at University of Manchester and International Legal Theory at Sciences Po, Paris. Her legal education spans over 3 jurisdictions: Jordanian, French, and British. She was a researcher and consultant on international law at a number of civil society organizations, including the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights, ECCHR, Transparency International, Syrian Legal Development, and HEC Paris. She is a member of Executive Committee at Lawyers for Palestinian Human Rights. Dr. Shahid is a writer on political economy of Middle East and North African region, as well as critical theory. Welcome to our webinar series, Dr. Shahid. It's an honor to have you as a guest on our webinar series.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, Dr. Shahid, my first question is, does Palestine has the right to resist under international law? Uh, uh, so do they have the right given the situation after the 7th October?
So the question spans actually right prior to the 7th of October, and I wrote a piece about this in my consultative status or position in relation to the current ongoing case at the International Court of Justice. And to classify whether or not the Palestinian people have the right of resistance, we have to classify what is the current status of the ongoing conflict. So as you know, there's currently a case in front of the International Court of Justice to question whether or not the occupation of Israel is illegal. So we can all agree in mainstream international law that Israel occupies the Palestinian territories, that is the West Bank and Gaza. However, we've been also hearing reports that we're responding to calls by international lawyers from a very long time about it being also an apartheid state. And then when you read more recent reports, you also find references to it as a settler colonial entity. And why would we say that? So Israel was founded in 1948. And it was founded through the mass displacement of Palestinians in what is an event called an-Nakba. So at the moment when the UN opened the question of whether or not we will recognize Israel as a state, then there was people, representatives of the Jewish agency and different Zionist agencies who were clearly referencing it as a colonial project. So the idea is it's a very classical thing: displace the indigenous population and place a new population. Last week also was the anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. That's when, in 1919, the UK promised Palestine to multiple Zionist agencies. So at the moment, it treated it as an empty land. But there were 700,000 people living there who were forcibly ethnically cleansed and displaced from that. And ever since then, we have seen systematic subjugation of the Palestinian people. We had decisions by the UN that decided to partition the land. Thus, we have the West Bank and Gaza. However, Israel continues to, ever since 1967, to occupy these lands. What it does is it practices effective control over them. And we do not have a very contemporary example to demonstrate to us how actually colonization works in the 21st century. Of course, there are other peoples in very similar situation, just like the people in Western Sahara. But what we can also see is not just an occupation of the land, but also the systematic exploitation and subjugation of the Palestinian people. So you see systematic infringement of the basic human rights, right of movement, right of health, right to water, right to food, the whole lot. And you also see extrajudicial killing, arbitrary detention, all of that. So a lot of people have come out and said this is apartheid, and apartheid is systematic racial segregation. So a system where one race is superior to the other. I actually very much agree with that analysis, and this is currently a part of the debate that's going to happen in front of the International Court of Justice. But a lot would argue that it is further. This is what we call in the 1960s, 70s ethos, alien domination and subjugation. So colonization, a grave illegality that is inherently against international peace and security. The elements are there, plain and clear. And the only reason we are deprived of calling it a colonial entity and using these words has been because of the politicization of international lawmaking. When you go to the 90s and 60s and 70s, you see that Palestine was seen right next to other colonized states, and it was a sister case of South Africa. So once we establish that the Palestinian people for the past 75 years have been living under alien domination and subjugation in all of its different forms, then we are able to say that the international people are under a grave illegality where the international community is not seized, simply because the international community doesn't have an interest in the Palestinian people. And further, the existence and expansion of Israel serves imperial interest in the region and also economic interest in the region. So once we establish that premises, the question comes of, is there an internationally recognized right to resist against a grave illegality where the international community is not seized? I would start by saying that it would be illogical if such a right did not exist, because then you would be telling the people that you will be living under this subjugation without giving you any means to challenge the status quo under which you live. So when we look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we find that in its preamble, it states that we have put forth these rights so as to avoid the people recourse of people into arms to protect their own rights. So you can see that it's actually implicit in the gravity of the illegality at hand that people would have the right to resist, because human rights inherently, systematically, and structurally haven't been upkept. But of course, the premises for this right goes much further. The International Court of Justice itself, when, for example, it looked at the resistance acts of tribes in Western Sahara, did not condemn them. But then in the 1960s and 70s, we had a very strong series of resolutions that were in favor of and recognition of the people's right of struggle against alien domination and subjugation by all means available. In many of these resolutions, all the way up until the 90s, Palestine was also directly referenced. Al-Intifada also, which was one of the biggest acts of resistance by the Palestinian people, was also seen and recognized as an act of resistance by the international community. Furthermore, in the Declaration of Friendly Relations, we also have a direct recognition of the right of resistance. And as we see in the decisions by Judge Robinson and Trinidad in the recent Chagos case, that resolution has normative value. Out of that resolution came a very important discourse that was actually advocated for by George Abissab, who was one of the leading scholars of international law. And there he actually pioneered the work during the drafting of the first protocol additional to the Geneva Conventions on the recognition of wars of national liberation. So if we go to the preamble of the additional protocol 1, we find that there is a recognition of movements of resistance against alien domination and subjugation. And we add to that references in the Third Geneva Convention as well, among a multiplicity of other references that show us that there is a customary rule. There is a premises to say that there is a customary rule for the people's right to struggle against alien domination and subjugation. I would also argue that inherently it is not against international humanitarian law, because the people under occupation do not have the duty of allegiance to the occupying power. So they have also the right to resist against that power. But it's very important to note that this argument is an argument that exists within jus ad bellum rather than jus in bellum. So I'm not talking about the conduct of hostilities. I am talking about the proper right at the moment of the start of the hostilities on whether or not one party has a right that is in opposition to another right. Israel systematically undertakes aggression against the Palestinian people. If you're looking at Gaza itself, Gaza has been under siege for 16 going on 17 years. A lot of people would argue that the siege itself is a crime against humanity of prosecution. However, my argument extends much further, again, beyond the 7th of October, and very important to understand 7th of October at all points of reference in its historical context. That being said, at all points, when any party engages in any acts in any armed act on either side, be it lawful or unlawful, has the duty to respect international humanitarian law. So that is a duty that all parties in the conflict have to abide by, and no party to that conflict is to be forgiven for any international humanitarian breaches of that international humanitarian law. And of course, if anything, we need to very clearly scrutinize exactly what happened in the past month by both parties under, of course, a place that upholds the rule of law. And if I may end just on a small note, which is that the actual reason why we don't have a lot of scholars talking about the right of resistance is because of the embedded epistemic violence in international law. On who do we listen to and who do we not listen to? Those who advocated for the right of resistance were states of the global south. Those who spoke for the right of resistance were people like George Abisaib, Judge Amoun, Judge Alvarez. These are all scholars from the global south. Historically, their voices were marginalized. The doctrine of sources also seems to overlook these voices in its making. So just because the positivist law has an itch about it, positivist mainstream legal spaces have an itch about it, that doesn't invalidate what is otherwise a very logical right, without which the Palestinian people would be deprived of their basic dignity and their basic right to equality by standing as agents for themselves and saying no to a grave illegality.
Dr. Shahd, you have shed light that Palestine has been subjugated, and Palestine has right under various human rights references and UN resolutions and Third Geneva Conventions. So Israel, as you said, that both sides have the duty to respect international law. If we look at the fact that Israel is focused on the idea that it has right to self-defense. So does Israel has the right to self-defense under international humanitarian law? And if we see the acts, all these attacks are discriminate and disproportionate, and they're targeting the civilians. So what is your opinion on that?
So Israel does not have the right to defend itself. Israel has the duty to protect its own civilians, and so does it have the duty to protect the people who fall under its control, including the Palestinian people as an occupying power. So in short, the answer to that question is, in 2004, in the Wall case, when the International Court of Justice was looking at the illegality of the separation wall built by Israel, it made a very clear point that you cannot say that you have self-defense against an area you occupy, since you originally are the aggressor. So you can't say that you have the right of self-defense against an area where you already practice your own control. So that just in a very short answer to that. However, also the UN Charter only gives the right of self-defense against state actors or non-state actors whose actions are imputable to a state actor. In this case, the acts of Hamas are not imputable to a state actor. And even if these two arguments, which I believe are a very solid premises for what we are arguing here, and any might deem them not convincing. When you partake in an act of self-defense, that act of self-defense needs to be within the military necessity and proportionate. So in this case, it is neither of those two. So in short, when we look at what the framework that Israel is trying to use, it is trying to deflect us through actually one of the most indeterminate spaces of international law, which is the terrorist framework that was kind of solidified in the wake of the 2003 war on terror. And if we've seen anything, is the exceptional state of affairs that the US created itself to justify what it did to Iraq, which then the whole world woke up to after years to find out that actually this is inherently an assault in the name of political and economic interests. So what Israel is doing is that it's hiding its economic and political interests behind this indeterminate legal framework to put forth this idea. But the plain presumption or the plain claim that it would have a right of self-defense against people it already occupied is inherently fallacious. And further, to say that the current onslaught is for the sake of the protection of the Israeli civilians is, well, questioning is really undermining the intelligence of the observers, because whatever happened on the 7th of October has its very obvious root causes. The only way to protect civilians in this case is to address these root causes, not to cause further violence and further trauma that will inevitably generate further violence further on in the future. So now what we see in front of us is a far right-wing fascist government using this legal language in order to hide away behind it. And not only that, it is legal language that it cannot claim for itself. And these are the positions that have been most recently, of course, ascertained by multiple state representatives and UN representatives.
Dr. Shahd, you've made it very clear that the aggressor does not have the right to self-defense. And we've also seen that Israel is using is cutting off the water and electricity and food. Is it a method of warfare under international humanitarian law? And is this collective punishment justified? Please, can you also shed some light on this?
So starvation as a method of warfare is a war crime. So that is currently what Israel is undertaking. Meanwhile, collective punishment is not also a justifiable method of warfare. It is inherently prohibited. So at no point may you undertake collective punishment against the peoples, because the whole idea behind this is that you respond with whatever is serving your military advantage. What Israel is saying is not only that I have self-defense, I have preemptive self-defense against any future violence that might erupt from this area, and hence I will destroy the civilian infrastructure and suffocate the civilians there. What we see at hand is a current enactment of Al-Dahiya doctrine, which is a military strategy by Israel that was followed in 2006 on the civilians of Al-Dahiya neighborhood in Lebanon, where its military officials clearly stated that their policy is to cause disproportionate harm in order to change the public opinion against the militias. But what in this case and what we have in evidence is none of that would actually change the positionality of the militias. Carpet bombing the most heavily populated area in the world is not a logical way to get any military advantage out of that. And the framing of this as simply, and what they're trying to do is to currently create an inference of Hamas equals ISIS, to portray that in an equal light is what we can call a method of lawfare in order and to use the language of international law and its indeterminacy to condition people to accept the mass killing of Palestinians.
Dr. Shahd, we're seeing the mass killings of Palestinians, and we've seen that it's an open and shut case for genocide, and we're obviously heading towards biggest ethnic cleansing. And we've seen that the global community, the UN, obviously, it has not been able to protect and prevent the fundamental human rights of the Palestinians. So, do you think that is the current international law framework still relevant, and what is the future of international law?
So this signals what's happening now is signaling a crisis of legitimacy for the international legal community and for international law itself. For years on, we've all been critically critiquing international law for its epistemic violence, for its colonial residues, for the politics of its making, and for the politics of its making and the politics of its practice. The actual reality of international law is a very positivist one, where we only look at these rules that are developed through a game of politics, and then we refuse to look at the notion and the question of justice. And not only that, we consistently devalue the voices of the vulnerable communities and the affected communities whose life inevitably gets shaped by international law. We've seen that, for example, with the climate discourse. We've seen that with the discourse against transnational corporations. And the laws of war have not been updated for a very, very long time. And the main reason is, when we look at it nowadays, most armed conflict happens outside the global north. Most people affected by it are people of the global south. Moreover, the economies that benefit the most out of it are economies of the global north. So you have this dynamic that we've been talking about for years. But what's happening now is that, as Foucault reminds us, in cases of extremity, power relations are laid bare. So we see the critique that we have always said just come and flash. So international law had this crisis of legitimacy, but now it has reached its edges. So in the past few weeks, actually, I was a part of efforts of people who were working towards the letter by academics to call that genocide is to call it genocide and to call the attention of the international community on this. And just to be clear, so genocide is the systematic aggression against people for the purpose of erasing them. What we have in front of us is very, very clearly articulated intent by the Israeli officials. And of course, we then have the practice itself showing us, because a lot of their attacks cannot only be justified by military necessity. Not only that, if we understand what we have in context of the Israeli policy, of Israeli project, then we see the genocidal intent behind it. Not only that, we also have case studies that show us, in the case of Myanmar, for example, the siege was a preemptory step to genocide. In the case of Rwanda, I believe, in the case of Serbia, I remember reading yesterday that actually the other parties were spreading propaganda against the Bosnians. And so here we can see that propaganda of the aggression and how atrocity propaganda was historically used and spoken of. So that we have a lot of, and in the case of Rwanda, of course, the world had the same thing and didn't stop it. So we have a lot of moments where we stood and spoke that the international community has failed us. And I went almost by now 2 weeks ago in front of multiple UN representatives and invoked the duty to protect. I said, we have enough evidence to demonstrate that we have the risk of a genocide, incitement on genocide, and we can even say that the genocide has already started. What I was met with was the classic disregard for the narrative of the people affected by the atrocities, looking at us as if de facto our lives are, we should accept that our lives are worth less within the halls of international law. So, and of course, it was driving all of us mad. How is it that we give you very concrete evidence of state representatives coming in and saying that the people they've been colonizing are animals, that the people they're colonizing should be annihilated, and you don't see this as a reason to step in to protect those people? And what we have is a clear articulation, of course, even of course in the very hesitant position of the International Criminal Court, and all of that we see very clearly how they're succumbing to the political influence. So not only is the international law itself politically made, its indeterminacy is now being pushed to the fringes of genocide infringement, let alone that the Genocide Convention itself is a really weak instrument because it was built in a way to make it almost impossible for anyone to be able to call on genocide before it happens. The debates that we are having currently are, and if I may say so, ridiculous and absurd. We are talking about the mass slaughter of people. We're talking about simple statistics. If it's a densely populated area, 50% children, most advanced military in the world, completely racist right-wing government that dehumanizes the people, complete control over under them. What more do you need? But of course, here we see it in front of our eyes that people wouldn't get listened to. So this is signaling a crisis of legitimacy. And if any way forward there is to international law, it is, and if there is any way forward also for the Palestinian people, if the blood that has been spilled is not to go to waste, if humanity that has actually, and the Western world that has shaked hands with war criminals are to vindicate themselves in any way possible, rather than being called the biggest hypocrites on earth, calling themselves with virtue naming. If any vindication is to happen, and if any of us are not to go mad, and to give any justice to those people, this needs to be a changing moment in the history of the Palestinian people and in the history of international legal making. The only way forward is for us to validate the voices of affected communities and voices of the Global South in the process of international law making, debate, and practice.
Dr. Shahd, 8 minutes are left, so if we can wrap up the next question within 5 minutes and we can join the link again. You can join from the same link again. So I'll proceed to the next question. I'll just take a few seconds pause so it can be edited. So yes. Dr. Shahd, we know that the Global South is advocating that, it's a case of genocide. And whereas we're seeing that Global North has economic interest and they are trying to legitimize it through international law. And as you pointed out, that International Criminal Court is being politicized, and gradually and slowly international law is succumbing to their narrative. So is this a slow and gradual expansion of the colonial project in 2023? So what is your stance on this?
I think that the colonial project already always existed. We live in a very neo-colonial world, and originally I am specialized in war economies and corporations. So neo-colonization is everything that I see around me. The structural exploitation of people, systematic, and the willful reductivity of international law, refusing to look beyond the direct causalities that we speak of. And not only that, when you even look at the direct lines of immigration, if you look at, for example, the work of Tendai Achim of calling migration as decolonization, and you have the very steep realization that actually the world is split into different types of humanities, and one humanity is getting the evolution of the technologies and the welfare that we have, while another is being systematically deprived of it. And the sad thing is that A doesn't recognize that that development is actually coming at the price coming from B. So this already exists, and international law is inherently complicit in that. I always call it the insecurity of international law, because it claims its legitimacy on the premises of some ideal of justice, but in reality, it lands at the service of power. But the case of Palestine, actually, and a lot of people have been saying this, offers us a moment of reflection as a world because of its extremity, because it is laying these forced relations bare, because it's allowing us to speak about this further. But the reality is, it exists always, it is there, and perhaps this is the moment that is required in order to start calling things by their name and taking that critique of the international legal community seriously. Because otherwise, what we would have in front of our faces and at our hands is an international legal system that actually caters to one type of people and not another type of people, which will make it inevitably illogical and ridiculous. If the international community chooses to go that way, then they have shot themselves in the foot. And as we see now, most people in the Arab world are really, really disheartened. I've seen colleagues who were literally saying, well, I should have never gone into international law. This is a completely useless discipline. And these are the people we actually need the most to re-envision how is it that we go forward. So giving further voices, allowing further spaces, and enshrining a new debate on what is it that we mean with justice and how does international domination, subjugation, and exploitation work to have an honest conversation where we're just not around there in suits looking nice and pretty for pictures is the only way international law can vindicate itself, I think.
So, Dr. Shahd, as we said that we need new voices in international law, and we need to start the honest discussions around the subjugation, the injustice, and around what's happening. So, how can the accountability of Israel's action be done in the international humanitarian law and under international human rights law?
So there is the question of whether or not international institutions would be able to do their job. We've been seeing a little bit of a shift in UN organizations over the past week. Some would say too little, too late, but we have seen it. We have seen a lot of lobbying against whatever positions that would be taken within the United Nations. But I think the United Nations itself understood that it would be in a crisis of legitimacy and in a crisis of hypocrisy if it refuses to do something or say something about this. But inevitably, of course, the United Nations does not have an accountability mechanism, except if some of the suggestions that actually were enacted for South Africa would be put in place. So now what we're looking for are very similar mechanisms that were put forth in relation to South Africa, which is the example that we're hoping to learn from. So in the case of South Africa, what happened is General Assembly resolutions that condemned and called things by their name. Condemning the illegality and the grave illegality at hand. And then moving forward, for example, there was a panel, it was open trials for corporations that were involved in South Africa, for example, and who were funding the regime. So that would be also a good thing. And then there were efforts for transitional justice that would happen within, and that would be very important because we will not be able to solve the question of the Palestinian people without transitional justice. Because if the very dreamy scenario of the Israeli forces leaving the West Bank and Gaza, one, there's the question of whether or not the two-state solution is actually a solution, because most of the natural resources during the partition, most of the natural resources were actually given to the land where Israel is now based, and the agricultural land and all of that. But aside from all what future we look at, we also need to talk about reparation and other forms of the acknowledgement of the historical harm done to the Palestinian people in order to enable them to economically overcome this and in order to also recognize the historical wrong that happened to them. So these mechanisms, we have a lot of historical examples where that has occurred, where we can learn from it. And also the UN can put an ad hoc tribunal for Palestine, but also we have seen that these ad hoc tribunals haven't been the most effective, seriously, but it will be a precedent where we have international accountability against people who are Western affiliated officials. And this is why the case of Palestine is such a challenge for international law. And this moves me on to whether or not accountability is possible in the International Criminal Court. So there is a case currently happening in the International Criminal Court ever since Palestine, after so many years of requesting it, was able to get the status of a state. So, however, we look at the International Criminal Court with utmost pessimism, because one, we believe that the team who is involved has what we can call a very reductive understanding of on the ground in Palestine, and this reductive position is reflective of their own experiences in the world, and inevitably that would mean that in the indeterminacy of international law, the narrative will still be pushed towards a reductive reading of international humanitarian law that, most importantly, doesn't take into consideration the deep asymmetry between the two parties involved. Israel is one of the biggest the biggest states in the defense industry internationally, has an advanced economy, very close ties to imperial powers. Meanwhile, the Palestinians are, for the most of history, left in a position of what we can call ethical loneliness. So there's a lot of elements that the ICC is not looking at, even though it can. But then so far what we've heard from the prosecutor hasn't been satisfactory at a whatsoever level. So we do look with utter pessimism on that. And also, again, the ICC has not, up until now, looked at the accountability of a Western affiliated official. So the question comes, like, when this actually a case starts, because now they could have also sent arrest warrants for Israeli officials who went directly on TV to say that we will annihilate people. But they didn't, and there could have been precautionary measures, but at the same time they didn't, and that tells you a political bias that we also saw. For example, when people tried to take the UK to the ICC, and the ICC said that it's not in the service of justice to do so. Which drives you insane when you think about it. So the other option, of course, is the International Court of Justice. Again, we have an ongoing case there on the illegality of Israeli occupation. There was, I think, 57 submissions to the International Court of Justice. As far as I know, only 5 of them were in favor of Israel's occupation. So there we will at least have the International Court of Justice saying that it's illegal. That will take us where? And that will take us into actually what could be the litigation possibilities using universal jurisdiction in different states. That option is currently being thought of in multiple states, and for the people to take it, for the people to challenge both Israeli corporations and Israeli officials abroad, because what we have in front of our faces are crimes against humanity and war crimes where we have universal jurisdiction for a lot of courts around the world. And so what we can call here is a move for strategic litigation. I have heard a lot about this in the past few weeks, and I think these efforts will be going further. And again, the other point is to also focus on the complicity of corporations and accountability of corporations involved in this. And I think that is also a very big alleyway for litigation. So in a very ideal world, we will see these state representatives behind bars where they deserve to be. But I remain at a point of pessimism, seeing that never happened to George Bush, and that never happened to a lot of the other actors who directly took in wars that we all now agree were led through conditioning and propaganda, and that inherently led to tremendous loss of people otherwise othered in the lens of international law.
Dr. Shahd, it's really important and crucial right now that if the rights of the Palestinians are not upheld right now, so what precedent will it set for the international legal norms?
If you can repeat that, I'm sorry.
Yeah. if we do not uphold the rights of the Palestinians right now, so what precedent will it set for the international legal norms? Because law and rights, we are at a very crucial stage right now, and we will see where the law and rights will go from this point onwards. So the whole world is looking towards the what will happen again, as we discussed, with the legitimacy of international law. So if it does not happen, so where do we see the international law going towards? What will be the precedent set in international law?
It will be a complete precedent of delegitimization. And I think, as you said, the whole world is currently now looking at the international legal community with the biggest evidence on hand to ask them where they are going. What Israel is saying now is that that the UN and other actors who are calling for international law have an anti-Israel agenda. So they're using this, again, very illogical argument against them. So I do not believe, unless we descend into a 1948 position where people are unable to talk. And also if Western states decide to take further their right-wing agendas, and I'm aware that that's what kind of Israel is backing on. It's backing on the repression of people in Europe, on the repression of people in the UK against common logic. We've already been seeing that all across the world with the repression of the right of freedom of speech for Palestinians, allies, and anyone, and including, of course, a lot of Jews who stood up against either Zionism or the current onslaught on Gaza. So we have two scenarios. Either the world falls into 84 scenario dystopian world where, for example, Israel now is pushing for a law where anyone who questions the Israeli narrative of what happened on October 7th goes to jail, which is again like authoritarian type of but no open space for discussion. And in the UK we see the right-wing government push for things like that. In Europe, in Germany, we see a very wrong illogical conflations, like a pro-Palestinian position is anti-Semitic, from the river to the sea is genocidal. It's all very fallacious, very illogical, and very ignorant positions, and very racist, because of course all of these laws are put forth in order to quiet the air. So it's either we descend to a world where the sounds of the peoples are completely quietened, and we have that sound of right-wing fascistic sort of thing where we fall into World War III, where we can say goodbye to international law anyway. Because also if Israel keeps on doing this, other forces in the area will inevitably respond. So it is calling for a major eruption of violence, because no one will stop, and no one also would allow them to push 2.2 million people into the desert. So of course now they've lost a lot of those people. So we either descend into that total war mentality back to 2003 and worse, perhaps back to a post we need to reshape the world again in the third world war. So again, that very pessimistic, but actually kind of what we are seeing in the polarization of the positions, because also this is happening at the backdrop of a shift in international powers, where we're moving from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. Or the other less pessimistic position, where what Israel is currently doing is read as Israel is shooting itself in the foot, and that actually the language of international law is actually used towards vindicating the Palestinian people. The only way we could do that is to start calling things by their name. To be honest, a part of my heart is optimistic, because we are starting to see that shift even in the media, because things are reaching a point of absurdity where things have to be called by their name. So if we have an awakening, and if that awakening comes at the price that it should come at, which is the vindication of the Palestinian people and ending this illegality, then there is a way forward, and that way forward will start with a conversation about how is it that we reimagine international law in a more justiciable way. So that is kind of what will happen. But on the other side, if that happens, and we will be one of the first few people to be like, well, there's no use for international law if we all fall into a world where a basic thing like debating or freedom of speech about a discussion or recognizing a people whose existence was denied becomes a criminal offense. So there's no logic in that. And as Fairuz tells us in one of her songs, سقط العدل. So justice has fallen, and then there's no answer to that.
Dr. Shahad, we know that we are at the brink where we are seeing two debates. One is a polarized world and obviously reimagining international law at this point, and the other is obviously that the genocide will be legitimized, and then obviously we'll stop believing in international law. So what we've observed is that peace is not on the international agenda of the global powers. So how can we ensure ceasefire in this given situation, and what role can the civil society organizations and the think tanks play to basically mobilize for the ceasefire? So what can we do to pressurize the international leaders, the global community, UN, and what role do you think we as a society should play? So what's our duty?
So the first thing is start with educating yourself. There's now an abundance of resources open about what happened, the history and everything else. So come from an educated position and come from a position where you're able to see what things are, and then amplify the voices of the people on the ground, of the international Palestinian community. Listen to the Palestinian community and what they are asking you to do. One, communicate with your politicians and express your dissent. Be loud and be clear that this will not happen in your name. If you are in Europe, if you're in the UK, or if you're in the US, this is happening in your name and in the name of protecting, quote unquote, you. So make sure that you actually make yourself heard, because now we stand at a position where it's clearly that it's the moral obligation of anyone who has the capacity and the privilege to do so to say no. And then one of the weaknesses of international law is that it's very state oriented. It only focuses on states. And as we all know, states do not always represent us. And it's not that the systems that we have now are functional. So there is a very big gap between actually the position of the people on the ground and the position of the governments. So there is a lot of, in European communities, there's a lot of people who are silent. And I'm presuming a lot of the silence comes from the fact that they're not really, they don't really conceive or perceive what is really happening. And those who are expressing their dissent are not being heard. However, if we pressure enough on the ground, if, as I think one of the representatives of Jews for Peace the other day said, we process this grief through action in whatever way possible. And the only way possible to do that nowadays is to go out to the street and express our positions loud and clear. Not in my name, never again, not to anyone. This is colonization, and we will not allow it to happen. And to tell the Palestinian people that we see you. So aside from political action, spreading and amplifying information, knowledge, and contacting politicians, we also have to work on the economic aspect of this. Last week, we saw the Belgian trade union successfully stop the shipment of weapons to Israel. We also saw some Italians this morning who are also thinking about that. So union action is really important. Active and civil action is really important. We also saw that on the docks of Boston. And we need to also see and express who are the economic affiliates of that system, and to also look at what are the economic actors that we are funding with our money who are helping facilitate these efforts and who are complicit with it. For example, when you look at last week, BP and multiple other energy corporations got the okay from Israel to on contracts to start exploration for gas in and some of the Israeli shores. These corporations are inherently complicit in that. And also to identify how does the economy, the war economy of this conflict act and behave. If you're an academic, know that yesterday four universities in Gaza were bombed. The University of Be'er Zeit issued a statement at the beginning of it, and it is our duty, not only as intellectuals, but towards our colleagues to do something. And also recognize the sources of information where you get these things from. A lot of people's sentiments have been, they've been run down or they've stopped acting. But the thing is that it's just simply because you are not seeing. And following the correct sources. For example, Eye on Palestine, Al Mizan, people even like scholars like Zachary Frost, for example, Jews for Peace. If you follow them through also non-traditional spaces, distrust in the media, and also spreading awareness about the wrong inferences, the inferential inflections, the problems put forth in the media, conditioning us to accept that. So these are just some ideas out of many on what can be done. But I think the problem is now is that the Palestinian people cannot help themselves. And Palestinian community and allies are and not only grieving and grieving heavily and have been working for 75 years, we have reached a point where the only way forward is actually for people to unite and recognize that the freedom of some people is connected to the freedom of others. This sense of interconnectivity is one of the only ways that will allow us to move forward as people. So to take this as a personal thing, to associate with the Palestinians, to associate with the father who had to hold the limbs of his child in his bag, and to say that this is not going to happen in the economic interest of my own government. The EU has been doing such horrible things all across. Look at simply it's how it handled the refugees, what its corporations are doing abroad, but it's still claiming its own legitimacy as a place where human rights are thought of. So to avoid that ultimate hypocrisy, everyone has to do something on whatever level, communicate with also your Palestinian colleagues and contacts, ask them what you think they can do, and they will be able to express that to you. Because if there's any moment we need to all stand in solidarity together in action and say no to colonization internationally and no to taking this further as a threat to international peace and security, we need to say it now. Our governments are not doing a good job at all.
Thank you, Dr. Shahd, for giving us your precious time. And we at Law and Research Network, we are our whole effort is to redefine international law from the global South perspective. And thank you so much for bringing out the voice of Palestine. As if we go back, and Nelson Mandela fought against the apartheid, and he was criticized, and then later on he was the hero to the world. And again, we are standing at this crossroads of history, and you very rightly explained to us that how, for example, there's a difference between one is a racist and they think of themselves as superior. And so international law does recognize the right of Palestine to resist the occupation against the occupier, as they are dominating and subjugating them. And we've also understood that Israel does not have the right to self-defense under international law, as it does not qualify as a non-state actor. And again, aggressor does not have legitimacy, and we've understood that cutting off food and water is not justified under international law. And again, exploring the different frameworks, like you've discussed with us, that international tribunals, and looking towards how the Western nations and those countries that are participating in it, we're looking towards, well, will they be prosecuted or not? And then again, at this point, all those people who are losing hope in international law, and because international law is so state-centric, and whenever there are challenges, law evolves. So we are at this juncture that we need to reimagine international law from the perspective of individuals, and we know that the point raising and highlighting the injustices, the oppression, and how the global north is playing around their economic interests. And again, there is a need, as you said, that we are at the brink at this juncture where, again, and not to be pessimistic, that it could obviously could be shaped around the world war, or we would be at this point where we would reimagine from the perspective of global south. And lastly, I would uh, just rephrase your message that we are the voice of the Palestinians. We stand in the global solidarity with the Palestinians, and just educate yourselves and speak to your political leaders, and make sure you speak to the Palestinians, and again look at the economic interest and the agenda, like the unions, like Belgium blocked the trade. So it's really important that we as a global community uh, stand up for the justice and the rights of the Palestinians and stop this global injustice. Thank you so much, everyone, for viewing our webinar. And again, Dr. Shah, thank you so much for educating us and talking about this important issue. And you can follow and subscribe our channel for upcoming webinars. Thank you so much.